Just a 30-minute drive from the European Union's border, the sleepy village of Mingjir, Moldova was once internationally recognized, not for its world-class wine vineyards, but for the growing willingness of its residents to sell their organs. On one occasion, 16 men were voluntarily transported to Turkey, where they were, quote, fattened up until a kidney recipient arrived for the operation, typically from the UK, Canada, or Israel. As they awoke from their procedures, each man received a meager sum of $2,000 before quickly being sent back home. Of the 16 men, 2 died from complications, while the rest required expensive medical treatments to prolong their lives. One man reportedly invested the money in a new car, but celebrations with homemade wine ended with the car smashed into a tree. While exact figures are elusive, it's estimated that 130 people in the village, which has a population less than 5,000, have sold their kidneys, equating to about 1 in every 38 residents. How desperate does a person have to be to sell a body part? How ruinous must an economy get for it to become a widespread phenomenon? As the 21st century dawned, Moldova had earned a grim statistic. It likely suffered the most severe peacetime decline in living standards and economic output of any nation in modern history. GDP had plummeted to just under a third of its 1990 level, amounting to just $400 per capita, placing it on par with some of the poorest regions on Earth. Its fortunes since have been bleak. In 2014, the country found itself at the epicenter of one of the largest financial scandals in history when $1 billion, equivalent to an eighth of its entire economy, vanished from 3 of its largest banks. The mastermind behind this heist has since evaded justice, even being elected mayor of a city just north of the capital. To mitigate the financial fallout, the National Bank issued $870 million in 25-year bonds, meaning the people of Moldova, already the poorest in Europe, have been and will continue to bear the financial burden until 2039. But it wasn't always like this. Once a relatively prosperous component of the Soviet Union, Moldova was an agricultural powerhouse that even specialized in high-tech manufacturing for aerospace and military applications. Its citizens enjoyed stable jobs, their children had access to quality education, and Moldova was even a sought-after vacation destination for Soviet elites. Now, among countries tracking such figures, only the tiny 10-square-mile island of Tuvalu welcomes fewer visitors each year. This is the unraveling story of Moldova, the poorest nation on the wealthiest continent. Today's video is sponsored by World of Warships, the exciting free-to-play naval combat game that brings history's most iconic warships back to roaring life. Navigate the turbulent waters of the 20th century in legendary ships, from stealthy destroyers, gigantic battleships, and game-changing aircraft carriers that once altered the course of history. With 40 unique maps now boasting stunning water effects, dynamic weather, and upgraded textures, you'll feel the thrill of naval warfare amidst waves so realistic they are virtually indistinguishable from the real deal. Dive into a dedicated community of captains on the official Discord, engage in live-stream tournaments, and enjoy the camaraderie of a passionate fanbase. And starting this month, all players can unlock exclusive rewards in the Captain's Club, snagging exciting offers from partners like Razer and GoPro. Oh, and did I mention, World of Warships is also available on consoles. So embark on your naval adventure now by clicking the link below and using code BRAVO for a loaded starter pack, featuring 500 doubloons, a whopping 1.5 million credits, 7 days premium account time, and a brand new ship awaiting your command. On June 26, 1940, just days after France's surrender to Germany in the Second World War, the Soviet Union issued Romania a terrifying ultimatum: relinquish the territory between the Prut and Dniester rivers within 24 hours or face an overwhelming invasion. The Soviets justified this demand by asserting that Bessarabia, the name of the targeted region, was inhabited by a majority Ukrainian population. It was not. In reality, Bessarabia, historically constituting the eastern half of the Principality of Moldova and primarily inhabited by ethnic Romanians, was once a vital component of the Russian Empire. It provided strategic access to the Danube River and acted as a protective buffer for its most significant Black Sea port. 20 years prior to the ultimatum, amid the chaos of the Russian Revolution, Bessarabia seized the moment to declare independence before uniting with Romania. The loss of the strategic territory was unacceptable to the leaders of the newly created Soviet Union. As such, they funded numerous violent incursions into Bessarabia in hopes of provoking a communist revolution. When this continued to fail, a chunk of land was artificially carved out from the Ukrainian Republic and proclaimed the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. Despite never having been a part of historic Moldovan lands, the region was designed to serve as a launchpad for Soviet propaganda. In theory, if the Republic succeeded, it would show the people of Bessarabia the benefits of Soviet progress. It did not. But these maneuvers did alarm the Romanian government, leading them to strengthen diplomatic ties with Germany to counter the rising Soviet threat. However, in a secret agreement in August 1939, the Germans and Soviets outlined how Eastern Europe would be carved up between themselves. With German disinterest in the region, the Soviets now had the green light to take back Bessarabia. With Germany strongly advising them to do so, Romania reluctantly conceded to Soviet demands. The following day, Soviet troops crossed the Dniester, beginning their occupation of lands persistently impoverished by geopolitical strife. Fearful of Soviet conquest, Romania had neglected Bessarabia. Only 30% of the population was literate. Rainfall often rendered the rudimentary roads impassable, and there was essentially no industry. Severe rural overpopulation exacerbated the problems, with subdivided plots of land barely sufficient for households to survive. Yet before the Soviets could embark on their grandiose plans for Bessarabia, the Germans launched the largest land invasion in human history into the Soviet Union, ultimately capturing the lands in July 1941. As the war eventually swayed in favor of the Soviets, the region was reconquered by 1944. Already underdeveloped before, the numerous armies that swept through Bessarabia had eviscerated all infrastructure, laid waste to the farmlands, killed half of all livestock, and displaced hundreds of thousands of families. With the war now over, the Bessarabian heartland was combined with the westernmost portion of the autonomous Moldovan Republic, known as Transnistria or the land beyond the Dniester, forming the new Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic. The remaining territories considered the most strategic were then allocated to the more trusted Ukrainian Republic. Indeed, Moldova was not treated as a region in desperate need of reconstruction, but as a land populated by untrustworthy Romanian sympathizers and class enemies. Pursuing a plan to, quote, break through to socialism by the shortest possible path, a shocking 13% of the entire population was eventually arrested, deported to Siberia, or executed to ensure ideological conformity. Not even the existing Moldovan communists were spared from this brutal purge. Only Moldovans from Transnistria were allowed to wield significant political power, as they were deemed more loyal, having already lived under Soviet rule for decades. To further entrench control and diminish Romanian influence, a campaign to socially engineer a distinct Moldovan identity, culture, and language was initiated. The Latin alphabet was banned and replaced by Cyrillic, and steps were taken to Russianize the culture. Simultaneously, as part of shaping the new command economy, private ownership of land, production, and distribution was outlawed, while farmlands were forcibly taken to establish expansive, government-controlled state farms. In the turbulent wake of this collectivization, exacerbated by back-to-back droughts in 1946 and 47, Moldova plunged into the most severe famine in its history. Soviet authorities then deliberately prolonged the famine to coerce reluctant peasants into joining the state-run farms, leading to a minimum of 115,000 fatalities. By the early 1950s, the political and economic turmoil began to subside, as Moldova swiftly became a well-integrated component of the Soviet state. lacking significant deposits of natural resources, but blessed with 75% of its total land area covered in black earth soils, the most fertile in the world, the Soviets devised a plan to transform Moldova into an agricultural behemoth. Vast amounts of capital, manpower, and technical know-how were poured into the state-run farms. With the introduction of fertilizers and tractors, along with experimentation with various agricultural models, output began to skyrocket. Despite occupying only 0.2% of the Soviet Union's landmass, it produced 4.2% of its vegetables, 12.3% of its fruit, 10% of its canned food, and 50% of its wine. At its peak, Moldova accounted for 30% of the world's tobacco and 20% of the world's grape harvest. Along with the construction of modern infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and power plants, the population's quality of life improved rapidly as illiteracy was eradicated and life expectancy increased by a decade. By the 1960s, a variety of industries, from tractor manufacturing to textile production, began to emerge. Later, the stationing of the Soviet 14th Army in eastern Moldova spurred the rise of associated industries, transforming the region into a key supplier of weapons, equipment, and components. However, the bulk of these new industries were situated in Transnistria, showcasing the central government's enduring preference for those residing east of the Dniester River. Although Transnistria comprises only 12% of Moldova, it generated 40% of its industrial output and 90% of its electricity. With the influx of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian specialists to man the new factories, Moldova increasingly became divided by two separate regions: a predominantly rural, agrarian, and Romanian-speaking Bessarabia on the one side, and an urban, industrialized, and Russian-speaking Transnistria on the other. In Soviet propaganda, Moldova was portrayed as a flourishing orchard populated by happy peasants blessed with bountiful harvests. But by the late 1970s, the reality in Moldova began to drift further from this idyllic image. Amid the broader Soviet Union entering an era of stagnation, widespread corruption and environmental issues started plaguing the republic. The first secretary, Ivan Bodil, embezzled millions of rubles, escaping prosecution through central government connections. Economic statistics were found to be inflated, while local corruption became the norm rather than the exception. Decades of intensive farming and heavy chemical use led to severe pollution of groundwater near the major rivers, while the 1986 Chernobyl disaster caused a spike in genetic disorders and birth defects. With worsening conditions, yet expanding political freedoms, the late 1980s witnessed the rise of the Popular Front, a coalition knitting together diverse political factions in opposition to the Communist Party. In August 1989, a Popular Front rally attracted 500,000 people, demanding Soviet troop withdrawal, Moldovan sovereignty, and a return to the Latin alphabet, the last of which was passed by the Supreme Soviet, in effect erasing the only difference between Romanian and Moldovan. But this concession by the government was not enough. By 1990, the Popular Front won a majority in the Moldovan Supreme Soviet, ending the Communists' monopoly on power. With the Soviet Union disintegrating shortly after, Moldova declared its independence on August 27, 1991. Prior to 1991, Moldova had enjoyed a mere 75 days of independence over the preceding 4.5 centuries. As independence dawned once again, there was a palpable sense that this too would only be a brief stint. A cornerstone of the Popular Front's agenda was a call for reunification with Romania. With the idea being widely popular in both countries, it seemed almost inevitable. Yet as preparations began, the country's minority groups, fearing marginalization, grew increasingly anxious. In the south, 5 administrative districts inhabited by the Turkic-speaking minority known as the Gagauz people proclaimed their own independence from Moldova. 2 months later, Transnistria followed suit. The Gagauz dispute was eventually settled peacefully, as the Moldovan government granted them a significant degree of autonomy. Offered the same deal, Transnistria rejected it. The region, historically privileged during Soviet rule, did not want to relinquish its political power or its command economy. By 1992, sporadic military skirmishes escalated to full-on war. Initially successful, Moldovan forces were pushed out from Transnistria when the former Soviet 14th Army, now under Russian control, intervened on Transnistria's behalf, ultimately forcing a ceasefire. This proved to be catastrophic for Moldova. The loss of Transnistria meant a significant part of its industrial base and 90% of its energy generation was gone. Worse, almost all trade infrastructure, including rail lines, pipelines, roads, and thus access to the region's most vital port, ran through Transnistria, which was now subject to blockades and economic blackmail, all of which occurred precisely when Moldova's economic system was becoming defunct. Essentially, for the preceding 50 years, Moldova's economy hinged on exporting its agricultural products to the rest of the Soviet Union, while it received very cheap raw materials, fuel, and funding for its public services. Upon independence and lacking any substantial natural resources, Moldova's reliance on this flow of goods persisted, yet it was now a matter of international rather than intrastate trade. This introduced new taxes, customs, time-consuming regulations, and of course, the complications with Transnistria. But most importantly, it meant Moldova could no longer obtain inputs at below world prices. Within just a single year, the cost of importing gasoline and natural gas surged 40-fold, while coal imports skyrocketed 100-fold. Yet decades of subsidized energy prices had resulted in Moldova being left with highly energy-inefficient factories, public services, and farms. Therefore, Moldovan independence resulted in nearly the entire economy becoming unviable almost overnight. GDP plunged by an average of 12.9% annually for 8 consecutive years. Inflation soared to 2,000%, and by the decade's end, exports in real wages were a mere quarter of their 1990 level. As government revenues evaporated, spending had to be dramatically pared down. By 1998, the annual per capita expenditure had fallen to $20 on healthcare, $31 on education, and $18 on Social Security. And despite these austere measures, the eroding economy, coupled with rampant tax evasion, propelled the national debt to skyrocket. The viability of an independent Moldova was now in question. Yet reunification with Romania had grown unpopular. Moldovans with access to Romanian television saw the country's post-revolutionary political chaos and feared it would spill over should union occur. By 1994, 90% of Moldovans voted for a policy of continued independence. Yet strangely, despite failed unification and a disintegrating economy, Moldova was receiving international praise for its reforms. On the surface, it was doing everything right. Privatization initiatives began even before independence, in which workers were given vouchers in quantity relative to the number of years they had worked. They could then use these vouchers to buy homes or shares in state-owned enterprises. By 1993, 80% of homes and over 2,000 companies were in the hands of citizens, equaling a third of all state assets. Later, the state farms were broken apart and distributed to 1.5 million workers, equal to over a third of the population. To halt hyperinflation, the government successfully introduced its new currency, the leu, which continued to hold its value far better than the other post-Soviet currencies. But just as it seemed the economy had hit rock bottom, it faced yet another external shock. In August 1998, Russia defaulted on its debts, triggering a severe financial crisis and economic downturn. Moldova, while now independent from Russia, had done little to diversify its trade reliance with it. 68% of all Moldovan exports still went to Russia on the eve of the crisis. Immediately after, total exports collapsed by 50%. The currency lost 50% of its value, which caused external debts to double to 106% of GDP. By the year 2000, Moldova found itself the undisputed poorest country in Europe. 60% of its population survived on less than 65 cents a day, causing the average daily caloric intake to plummet from nearly 3,000 calories to 1,900. Among 60 nations assessed by the World Values Survey, Moldova was the least happy country, a sentiment reflected in its soaring per capita alcohol consumption rates, ranking near or at the top globally. An estimated quarter of the population fled the nation in search for better opportunities, including the young and skilled workers vital for rebuilding the economy. Desperate for improvement, Moldova became the first and only post-Soviet state to elect the Communist Party back into power in 2001, securing 50% of the vote and 71% of parliamentary seats. The Communists, under Vladimir Voronin, aimed to realign the country with Russia. This move was motivated by hopes of resolving the Transnistria issue and achieving better trade terms. Negotiations with Putin regarding Transnistria initially proceeded smoothly, with both parties reaching a consensus on the terms. However, on the eve of signing the agreement, domestic demonstrations and pressure from the EU compelled Voronin to back out from the deal. Putin retaliated by retracting all future commitments to withdraw Russian troops from Transnistria, where they remain to this very day. Failing to draw closer with Russia, Voronin pivoted back toward the West, expressing desires for European Union integration, a prospect seen by many as impossible at the time. Nevertheless, the rhetoric helped secure another communist victory in the 2005 election. In its second term, the Communist Party expanded its control over Moldovan society. Journalists were harassed, the media was censored, judges were replaced by party loyalists, and political opponents were intimidated. The party used its power to extract bribes from the population and transferred state assets to themselves, their families, and their supporters. Voronin's son, Oleg, seemed to have magically become the most successful businessman in the country, having his hand in every aspect of the economy, including construction, finance, transportation, supermarkets, restaurants, and car dealerships. Yet Voronin was far from the first to initiate widespread corruption in the country. Upon independence, those with insider knowledge and political connections had exploited the transition period to amass immense wealth and power while the country descended into abject poverty. While on paper, Moldova succeeded in distributing the country's wealth to its citizens, in reality, a select few obtained all the valuable assets while the rest competed for the scraps. Low wages for politicians and non-transparent government institutions inherited from the Soviet Union incentivized the new leaders to align themselves with the oligarchs, adjusting policies and laws to further benefit the rich and themselves, and bribing police and judges to avoid prosecution. For the last 30 years, Moldova has consistently ranked among the most corrupt post-Soviet states. Even as the Communists lost power to pro-Western political parties in 2009, those that came to power allowed corruption to reach its most visible and audacious extent. In 2014, Moldovan oligarch Ilan Shor had discreetly acquired majority stakes in 3 of the nation's largest banks. Following this acquisition, the banks began issuing fake loans to Moldovan companies also tied to Shor. The funds were then funneled through a series of shell companies, primarily in the UK and Hong Kong, and eventually landed in Latvian banks. In total, $1 billion was stolen from the country. The ensuing financial crisis amplified the nation's debt, temporarily cut it off from international financing, and led to the currency losing more than 40% of its value, further impoverishing the population. Subsequent investigations revealed a former member of parliament, a former prime minister, and the leader of one of the country's largest political parties had all either directly profited from the scandal or took bribes to look the other way. As corruption has become so embedded, all the way from judges prosecuting politicians to doctors giving patients better care, foreign investment remains painfully low, skilled workers leave the country as soon as they can, while the money they send back to their families represents nearly all of the GDP growth seen in the last 2 decades. While some anti-corruption drives have begun to occur, and recent entry into an association agreement with the EU granting tariff-free trade will help farmers, it is yet to be seen if underlying conditions will improve. Conflict in neighboring Ukraine and fears that Russian troops in Transnistria will be used to open up a second front have only further complicated Moldova's future. Some nations are cursed with a lack of natural resources. Some are ensnared within an unstable region, while others suffer from political instability and corruption. Moldova has been relegated to all three for nearly its entire existence. Situated at the crossroads of many empires, it was perpetually impoverished by geopolitical strife. When it was finally able to develop, the economic and political institutions created primed the nation for disaster upon independence. Without a strong state, without a coherent national identity, and without an existing viable economy, Moldova was expected to build all three simultaneously. Foreign intervention then divided it, individuals with connections then exploited it, and corruption became so widespread that even those who stole billions have been able to avoid justice and even maintain political popularity. To embark on a sustainable path toward improvement, the Moldovan people have the Herculean task of shedding the shackles that its unfortunate history has placed upon it.